Alright, welcome to Lesson 2 of our Bootstrap course on Native SDK. At this point, you should know from the previous lesson whether or not Native SDK is the right tool for your problem. So today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be getting into the meat of things. We're going to be showing you how you can get the most essential parts of Native SDK working. So the way that's going to work is, first of all, we're going to be giving a quick little tutorial on how do you just get a minimum working example with Native SDK at all. And once we've done that, then we're going to start talking about data. Because obviously, if you can't get data into the chart, you can't do a lot of very interesting things, now can you? So we're going to be talking about how you can get your data into Native SDK in all the different chart types that Native SDK offers. With that then, let's talk about how we can get a minimum working example with Native SDK. And the easiest way to do this is just with a good old-fashioned HTML file. So I'm going to go ahead and create an empty file. We're going to call this just example.html. And you can open this in your favorite text editor. And what we're going to do here is just create a basic HTML document. So we're going to specify doc type HTML. We're going to use the standard HTML tag. So this is the whole body of our document. And like any HTML document, it's going to contain a head and a body. And this is the basic setup of an HTML file. Now to make this use ZoomCharts, the big thing you'll need really is just to import the ZoomCharts library. And you can do this just by putting a script tag in your HTML header. And the source for this is you'll want to use the ZoomCharts CDN to get the latest ZoomCharts version. So what you can do here is you can simply use this link, https://cdn.zoomcharts-cloud.com/1/latest/zoomcharts.js. And that's all. If you don't want to type that out, you can also find this in the link to most of the demos that we have on our demo page. You can simply click on the JS Fiddle link and it will have exactly this line because it's the easiest way to import ZoomCharts. And once you have that, your HTML file is all ready to get started with your first Native SDK chart. So there are two things that are required to get a Native SDK chart working. First of all, you need an HTML element that actually contains the chart. So the way you do this is, easiest way is just with a div, and I'll give this an ID called chart, which is what we will pass to ZoomCharts later on so that it can know, hey, this is where you want your chart to show up. And of course, if you had a more complete page, then this would probably be somewhere, say in your web page, you have this particular area of the screen you want the chart, and you would just place this div there, and ZoomCharts would take over from there and automatically place the chart exactly where you want on your page. But here, this is the only thing, so there's no further considerations. And after that, I'm just going to put some scripting inside the HTML file, just for sake of example. Obviously, you could, of course, and of course we want to mark this as a text/JavaScript script. And of course you could import this, and that's probably how you should do this if you're making a bigger app. Just do something like this to import your script that sets up ZoomCharts. But again, for sake of example, I'm just going to go ahead and do it all in one file. Now, initializing ZoomCharts, very easy. Watch this. I'm going to create a variable to hold our chart. I'm just going to call it chart. And to create a ZoomCharts chart, all you have to do is say new ZoomCharts dot, and then the chart type you're interested in. In this case, just to get us started, let's say you want a NetChart, and we'll look at the other charts in a bit. So this is almost what you do. Now this does take a parameter, it's just a JavaScript object, and this is your settings. This will configure what sort of chart ZoomCharts creates for you. The most important setting is probably the container, which, as you might guess, refers to this. What HTML element is going to contain the chart? We already created that, and it's ID chart, so I can just pass in chart just like that. And this is almost enough by itself. The other thing you really want, though, is some data, because without data, there's just not much to see. And I'll again talk about how to do this later on, since it's such an important element. But just to get us started, I'm going to use a feature of NetChart which allows us to generate random data. So what we can do is say random nodes and specify a number of random nodes that it will generate. So I'll say 20. I can also specify random lengths and say we want 21 random lengths. Just sake of example, something to look at. And with all that, I can put my HTML file in a browser, and look at that, we have our very first chart all set up, just like that. So now you know how to get a minimal example of native SDK up and running. Next, we're going to start talking about data, because random data might be nice just to give you something for the sake of looking at, but at the same time, it's not very useful. In the real world, you have actual data sets, whether they be data files or in databases or somewhere else. And generally speaking, you want to get those into your data visualization software so that you can, visualize the data. That's kind of the whole point. So here's how you can actually get your data into native SDK. One of the most versatile ways to do that is what we call the preloaded option. So the way you do this is in data, you specify preloaded. And what this is this JavaScript object right here that we're setting as preloaded is interpreted as a data object. So if you already have your data available, say maybe you have some other code here, and this code happens to load your data for whatever reason, then you can just pass the data object straight into ZoomCharts like that, be something like data object, and boom, job done. You load up the file and you would see all your data. And that's probably one of the biggest use cases of preloaded. You could also, if you have some other software that you like to use for loading data, you can use that instead of some of the features ZoomCharts offers. You can use, say, jQuery and make an AJAX request for your data and then just pass it in. Or you can write some custom data loading code, or you can generate your data on the fly if that's the sort of use case you have. So again, this is very versatile. There's a lot of ways you can get data into the chart here, but what they all have in common is one way or another, you end up with a data object and you can just pass that straight in. That does raise the question, what does a data object for ZoomCharts even look like? And that's what I'm going to show you, because it's slightly different for the different chart types, so I'm going to be spending a little bit more time on this particular way of loading data than others, so that I can familiarize you with the sort of data format ZoomCharts expects, depending on what chart you're using. In the case of NetChart, the data format is very simple. You have two things. You have nodes, which is an array containing all your nodes, and you have links, which is an array containing all your links. And that's it. That's the data format for NetChart. And what a node looks like is it's an object, and the main thing it requires is an ID. So I'll just give it an ID of N1. Now there's other parameters supported here. For example, you can have like special style options saying this particular node should look this particular way. And you can contain some extra data here if you need to reference that later in the chart. For example, just some various data fields associated with this node. But this is really the core thing you need just to get something. It needs an ID. So I'm just going to, for sake of argument, I'm going to give it 5 nodes. And in fact, even with that, I can refresh, and you see we have 5 nodes. So that's perfectly valid even without any additional links. Now, for the links, the way these work is very similar. They're all JavaScript objects, and they require an ID. So I'll just call the link L1. And the big field you are interested in here, or big fields rather, are the from field and the to field. So what these do, as you might surmise, is these specify a node ID of where the link comes from. In this case, we're coming from N1, and which node you're going to, in this case, N2. And so this is how you specify all the links in your chart. So if I refresh, you should see now there's a link between N1 and N2. And very simple. So I can go ahead and create a few other links just for sake of demonstration. Let's say we want one between N2 and N4, and maybe we want one between N4 and... Actually, let's do N3 and N1. And there we go. And while we're at it, I'll also demonstrate a link from N5 to N5. So you can have self-links too, and those show up just fine. As with nodes, there are more options you can put in here. And if you're interested in those, I strongly suggest you consult our documentation, which gives a further review of all the many different options you can put here. But the general idea applies. You can have metadata, you can have additional style options, you can have a few additional configurations that apply to the links, which I'm not going to go into crazy depth here because this is supposed to be a bootstrap course, not an in-depth review. But I want you to know that is possible. This is not the limit of what is possible with data in ZoomCharts. This is just the essentials. By the way, one thing I should mention is you may have noticed I've put all these fields in quotes. Strictly speaking, the names like nodes don't need to be in quotes. I could just delete these, for example, and refresh. Exact same thing works. So the only reason I've done this is to emphasize that this particular object, it will never contain anything that's specific to JavaScript objects as opposed to JSON valid objects, if that makes sense. So what you could do is you could actually take this data object and export it as a JSON file, or conversely, you could store your data as a JSON file and import that as the data object, and that's just fine. There's no extra special JavaScript shenanigans that go on in the ZoomCharts data file. So that is a possibility, and I'm just using quotes to emphasize that. And with that, we have covered the basics of setting up a NetChart in ZoomCharts native SDK. Obviously, our NetChart is still pretty basic at this point. We could do a lot more with this. We could do all kinds of styling on these nodes. We could add more interactions beyond the default that you get automatically. But we could add more. We could customize these. We could make it interact with other things. We could, even on theme for this video, we could discuss different ways of loading data other than the preloaded method. But at this point, I want to draw some attention to the other kinds of ZoomCharts, and we'll talk more about some of the ways you can make your charts more interesting and impressive later on. So, the first extra chart I want to talk about is our PieChart. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm actually going to create another chart element. So this shows you how you can have more than one chart on the same page, and it's very straightforward. You just have a different element for your chart. I'm calling it highly imaginatively chart2. And I'm going to name my variable in JavaScript the same thing, chart2. And the way you create this, as you might guess, you do new ZoomCharts. And since we want a PieChart, what do you think we type? Why, yes, we do in fact type PieChart. And the way this works, very similar. You want a container, and this container, in this case we want chart2, not chart1. And we want data, which in this case I'm just going to say preloaded, because of course we're still talking about preloaded, and I want to be able to show off the PieChart data format for you. And I'm going to leave it empty. I'm going to pass an empty data object for now, just so we can see this up and running. So I'm going to refresh the page, and if I give extra room so you can see all the charts, you see we now have a completely blank PieChart over our old NetChart. So you can have multiple charts on the page just fine. Very easy. It's as simple as creating another chart. Now the way the PieChart data format works is it's all about the subvalues. You have this object called subvalues, And this contains all the different data points that are going to be in your slices. And at this point, you're probably wondering, why on earth is it called subvalues? That will become clear very shortly. But for now, just take my word for it, it's subvalues, and there's a good reason for that. And in your subvalues, as you might expect, there are values. So let's say I want value 50 and name. I'll just call this slice 1. So this is how a basic element of PieChart data works. You have the name of whatever's in the pie and whatever value is associated with it. So I'm just going to go ahead and create 3 slices. And I'm going to call them, well, slice 1, 2, and 3. But I'm going to put the values at 50, 30, and 20, just to give something. And there you go. With that, we now have a bunch of slices in the pie chart. So very simple, very straightforward. Now, just like with NetChart, the 2 options I have here, value and name, are not everything that goes in to a pie chart data object. You could also have, for example, the style option, or you could have, for example, some extra data in here that maybe you want to carry along for some other operations, or you have a bunch of various miscellaneous settings that, if you're interested in, I highly recommend you consult our documentation. There is, however, one really big one that I do want to cover here. And that's the option that enables drill down. Because you might have noticed, right now, our pie chart just has these 3 data points. You click on them, nothing interesting happens. A very common use case is you have this slice, and actually there's some subdata here. Here's all the data that composes slice 1. How can I create a pie chart of that and explore it further? And you do that with drill down. The setting that enables this is called subvalues. And you might already see the significance of the top values, subvalues here. But I'll talk about that later. Right now, let's talk about how to implement drill down. So the big thing here is subvalues is an array. And in this array, what I'm going to have is more PieChart data objects. These represent all the different data points that compose slice 1 and that we want to be able to drill into. So I'm going to create a few data points like before, and let's make these a little bit more fun than just slice 1, 2, and 3. I'll call this one applesauce. I'll make 4. I'll make one called applesauce, one called tomato, one called cheese, and one called spinach. So apparently slice 1 is composed of a lot of various culinary ingredients. Whatever slice 1 adds up to. I will leave that to your imagination. And if we have all those in our subvalues, now, as long as I wrote that correctly, we should be able to refresh, and you'll notice slice 1 has this nice little border around it, indicating, hey, this can be drilled into. You can see what composes slice 1 and not just select it. So let's do exactly that. Let's click on it, and what do you know? We now see all the different ingredients that compose slice 1. And we also get this nice little back button, and that happens automatically. There's no special configuration needed to be able to go back to the level above. And this, as you might surmise, is the mystery of why the top level data is called subvalues, because the top level data is itself considered a PieChart data object, just one that we're drilling into to see everything that composes it. And this is also nice because it means later on you can do things like, for example, I can use just slice 1 as my data object, and I immediately see all the data that composes it. So that's one of the really nice things about the PieChart data format. It's recursive, so you can use any element as sort of the top level, so to speak, that you're viewing and exploring. And you can easily combine different data sets to create, well, this extra drill down effect and see different data sets composing other data sets. And with that, that's pretty much the basics of PieChart and the PieChart data format. Next, I'd like to talk about FacetChart. So just like before, I'm going to create another element for this. And this time, I'm actually going to copy PieChart, and I'm going to use that as the basis for FacetChart. This is going to be chart 3 in container chart 3. And instead of PieChart, we're going to have a FacetChart. And what do you think is going to happen if we just run it like this? We automatically get a FacetChart. So yes, the secret to FacetChart is the basic data format is basically the same as PieChart. So even the drill down, so I can go to slice 1 and drill down, and there you go. We see our elements. So this is a nice thing to keep in mind. If you have a visualization in PieChart format or FacetChart format, and for whatever reason you think some part of it or all of it would also be valuable in the other format, it's very easy to do. You can literally just pass in the data and things will work. That said, there is something you can do in FacetChart that you can't do in PieChart, and that is have multiple series in the same visual. Let me show you what that means. So the first thing we need for this is more than one value in the same data object. So to do this, I'm going to create another data point. I'm just going to call v2. I'm just going to give it a very simple example value. And I'm going to put this in all of the different objects. There you go. And with that, I'm just going to randomize the values a little bit. Sure, something like this. And that way, that'll just give us something a little bit more interesting to look at. Sure, there you go. So once we have all this, the first thing you'll notice is when you refresh, nothing happens. That's because, of course, the chart doesn't know to use this extra v2 value we've added for anything because v2 isn't a special value that ZoomCharts looks at. And this is true for anything. So if you put in any value in your data object that ZoomCharts doesn't recognize, it's just kind of there. It doesn't do anything, it's just happens to be in the dataset and ZoomChart ignores it. So the way we can use this though is we can tell ZoomCharts, hey, this value, whether it's v2 or any other name that ZoomCharts isn't looking at, this is another series. And you can display that as part of the data. Here's how that works. So this involved the series settings. This talks about all the different series of data in our data objects. So what we have is we have an object representing the series that we're using. I'll call the first series 1. You could call this anything. The big thing here, though, is data. This tells ZoomCharts what data it should be looking at for the series. The first series is the one we already have, the one looking at the value field. But we can have more than one of these. We could have another series, say series 2. And we can tell ZoomCharts explicitly, hey, look at the v2 field in the data object for this particular series. And now if we run, you see, hey, there's more than one piece of data being displayed in the FacetChart. We have 2 different series. And we still have drill down as well. We can drill down and see all the different series for that. And of course, there's many different configuration options you can have. You can make these, say, lines instead of columns. You could make these stack on top of each other. You could, again, all kinds of configurations, but this is just the basics of how do you get multiple series of data into a FacetChart. And this is the basics of how that works. So with the basics of FacetChart out of the way, let's move on to TimeChart. So again, I'm going to create another div for this, chart 4. Obviously, if you were actually making some application, you might want some better names than this, but again, this is an example. So chart 4, new ZoomCharts.TimeChart. Same general idea, container, chart 4. And data in TimeChart is a little bit different, and I'll show you in a moment. So right now, I'm just going to create a TimeChart with no preloaded data. Let's see what happens. And at this point, you see it's loading. TimeChart doesn't really work too well with no data. It's trying to figure out the data bounds, and since I haven't given it any data bounds, it's not very happy. So let's just go ahead and talk about the data format. So the big thing in here is the unit, which tells you how big a data is, and I'll talk about that in a moment. For now, let's just set it to milliseconds. And the values, which, as you might imagine, contain the actual values. And notice the values are arrays, not objects, in TimeChart. So the way this works is you start out, the very first element is the time. So let's say I want data at 2019 11-24, just some random date. And you can specify this as a string. You can also specify it as a timestamp, which I would actually really recommend if you have them available to you, because that just removes any challenges of getting the data to be parsed correctly, and it just makes life a lot simpler when ZoomCharts can say, yes, this is the exact time, no extra complications to be dealing with. And the next elements in the array, as you might imagine, are the data points, and you can have more than one here. So for example, you can have 3 and 10. And this is basically how a TimeChart dataset works. So let's just have data every day, make it 310, make that 1, 5, make this, sure, 30 and 20. And there you go, here's a very basic example of a TimeChart dataset. What the unit does here is it tells how much time one of these units covers. And this might make more sense if I actually refresh and show you. So you see here it's showing you the dataset, and you notice I'm specifying data every day, but they aren't taking up one entire day worth of time, if that makes sense. Like the November 24th data point isn't taking up all of November 24th. It's taking up, if I zoom in, a very small amount of time. It's less than an hour, less than 5 minutes, and you might guess at this point, if I keep zooming in, it's only going to bottom out at the millisecond range. So yeah, so that's what this unit refers to. It refers to how big of a span of time each of these data points is taking up. If I change these to, let's say, hours, for example, and refresh. So zoom in, so it's still taking up less than a day. If I zoom in, it's taking up an hour, but I can't zoom in below an hour here. It just, the data disappears because, well, that's how much time it takes up. It takes up an hour. There is no smaller data to be viewed. I can zoom in, but there isn't any data for sub-hour level. So that's how the unit works. And this is part of the reason why TimeChart's a little bit different than the other charts. But yeah, this is a very basic example of how you get some data into TimeChart. Now there are two important extra details that go along with TimeChart. The first is, just like with FacetChart, TimeChart supports series. So the way I utilize that is very similar to in FacetChart. I have the series list, and here the critical objects are a little bit different. I want an ID, and in data, since the data format's different, I don't want a field, I want to specify the index. So index 1 refers to, of course, the first index. That is the first index other than the timestamp itself. And if I add another one, let's see, S2, I can specify index 2, and that'll give us this extra data that we put in. So now if we refresh, you'll see now we have both series, not just one or the other. And again, the concept here, very similar to FacetChart. The other wrinkle that TimeChart brings to the table is the data limits. So in preloaded, aside from just unit and value, you can also specify data limit from and data limit to. And it's really highly recommended that you specify these. What these do is they tell ZoomCharts this is the range of data these values represent. Because just because 11-24 happens to be the first value in the dataset doesn't necessarily mean that 29-11-24 is the earliest date this dataset is representing. Maybe, for example, data collection began on 2019 11-20, and for whatever reason, there was just no data until the 24th. And same thing at the end. Just because this is the last data point doesn't necessarily mean this is, well, the end of the data range. Maybe the data continued to be collected until 2019-11-28, for example. And for whatever reason, there is just nothing on the 27th. So this is a very useful thing. And also, ZoomCharts takes that into account. So you see now we have arrows saying, hey, there's more to this data set. There just happens to not be any data in those particular positions. One thing to watch out for is data limit 2 is exclusive, not inclusive. So if I do, let's actually just keep this very simple. Let's say I put the first date and the last date in. So you notice now it's not wanting to consider, well, the 26th, because it says, the 26th, it's exclusive, so this data point is just extraneous. It's not really part of the valid range, because there's no data collected after the 26th. And since technically something that starts on the 26th and spans an hour goes beyond the 26th, this data point is now considered out of range. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're specifying your data ranges. And there you go. So that's really the only wrinkles to TimeChart. Obviously, as with all the charts, there are more details in all of these that you can go into and highly customize to precisely represent your data use case. And just to be clear, I definitely do recommend including data limit from and to, preferably in timestamp format if that's available to you. It's just a lot easier to get ZoomCharts to represent what you want it to when that data is available. With that, we're going to move on to the final native SDK chart type. So we're going to create a chart number 5. We're going to create const chart 5. And guess what this is going to be? Well, if you know our chart, you probably know. It's a GeoChart. So just like with everything, this requires the container. And we're going to need data. Now, GeoChart's a little bit different than some of the other charts. So let's go ahead and just refresh and see what this is like. So yeah, immediately upon starting up, you see we have, well, this nice geographical map of the world, where presumably all of our geographic data would be presented if only we provided any, which, as you can see, we didn't. So let's remedy that. The basic format for GeoChart data is very similar to NetChart data. So we're going to have nodes, and we're going to have links. So very, very similar. This should be familiar if you remember back to when we did NetChart. For the node object, we're going to want, as you might guess, an ID. So I'll just call this point 1, just to give something. I'll create another node called point 2. This is almost what we need to get GeoChart working, but before I get into that, I'll just go ahead and show you links. So again, we have links. I'll just call this L1. And this is from, like before, we specify the node we want to go from and the node we want to go to. All this so far, exactly the same as NetChart. Nothing special yet. The big difference is we need coordinate data to know where in the world these nodes are. So if I refresh, you see right now, we don't see anything. Partially because we don't actually have any coordinates. There's actually another reason, which I'll get into in just a second. But first, let's remedy the coordinates. So if I'll just format this a little bit differently. I specify some coordinates. Let's say we want this at 24 and 57. Just to give it some location in the world. Also, don't forget your commas. And same thing with point 2. I'll format this a bit. And let's say we want this, let's say we want 24.5. So we're going to move a little, not that much. And let's keep it at 57. Let's not make this too complicated. So with that, we now have 2 points. If we refresh, you notice we still don't see anything, even if we pan around the world a bit. The reason is GeoChart's a little bit different than NetChart. It doesn't just support nodes and links, though of course that's still the basic idea. It also supports shapes and several other different layers, as GeoChart calls it, of objects you can have on top of the map. So in order to actually see anything, you don't just need your data, you also need to specify what layers you want to display in the chart. In this case, the layer I want, again, this is going to be an array of all the different layers. I'm going to have the object representing the layer. I'm going to have, this one I'm just going to call points, because that's what I have points. And the big thing here is I want a type items layer. An items layer is one that contains nodes and links like a NetChart, except of course with geographic coordinates. And with that tells us enough that we can actually display something in GeoChart. So you see we have our 2 points right in the middle of Latvia. We have 1 point in Riga, or pretty close by, and the other a little bit off in the east. So those are our 2 points. And that's really the gist of how the GeoChart data format works, at least if you're specifying points. You would specify these IDs and coordinates, and so forth and so on. To an extent, preloaded is a little bit less useful in GeoChart relative to the others. It's still useful, of course, as you see, but one of the things about geographic data is there's also some special data formats for this sort of thing, like the GeoJSON format. And GeoChart supports that. So, depending on your use case, you might actually not have to deal with the ZoomCharts format as explicitly. You could just import, say, a GeoJSON file and get what you want, if that really covers all you want in your use case. This is still useful for the cases where you want more than that, or you want something very customized that's not in GeoJSON format, or what have you. But that's the gist of it. I'm not going to explore the details of GeoChart and all the different layers too deeply right here. That might be talked about at some other point, or better yet, you can look at the documentation for how all these different layers work if you want to set something up with GeoChart. But this is the bare basics of how you get something working in GeoChart. And with that, we have officially covered all of the chart types in Native SDK, and we now know how to set up the data for all of them. So at this point, let's try and wrap up and summarize all the different things we've learned in this video, and what you should now know. The very first thing you should know is how to set up a native SDK chart at all. You should know that it's as simple as doing 3 things. Number 1, you need to make sure you've included the script for ZoomCharts native SDK. It's as simple as including that script tag somewhere in your file. Number 2, you need an HTML element that will contain the chart. It can be as simple as a div with some ID that you can refer to ZoomCharts later on. And number 3, you need JavaScript that actually creates the chart, which is as simple as calling new ZoomCharts whatever chart type you're interested in, telling it about the container, and then providing your data. And that's all there is to getting started with native SDK. The other thing we learned in this video is how to provide data to your native SDK charts, so you can actually make the charts do something more interesting than just create something in the first place. And we focused especially on the preloaded method of data loading, mainly because that lets us emphasize what is the format you need to provide data in. You learned in the case of NetChart, it's as simple as having a list of nodes and a list of links. The main thing is these all need IDs, and this way, when you specify a link, you can simply specify from node ID to node ID. We learned in the case of PieChart, all the data is in a subvalues array. This contains the names of all the different slices and what value they have. And we also learned that this can have subvalues within the slices. And that's how you provide drill down. So you can drill down into deeper data levels and so forth and so on. We learned that FacetChart has exactly the same data format as PieChart, for the most part. the main difference that FacetChart has that PieChart doesn't is you can have multiple series. So I can have more than one value in a single data object, and I can set up series that display all those different values, and you still have the drill down and so forth. We learned that TimeChart, the big thing here is the data is in this values array, which specifies the timestamp and all the values at that particular time. And the main thing in TimeChart is you need to take into account that you need to specify the unit, specifying how big is each of these data, how much time range is this particular, data covering. And also you want to specify the data limit from and to specify, what is the range that this whole set of data is representing? What range of time does that mean? And much like with FacetChart, you can specify series of different datas at, the same time. The main thing is the format's slightly different, but the general idea is basically the same. And lastly, we learned about GeoChart, which has the same basic nodes and links format as NetChart for at least basic data points. The main thing there is you need to specify coordinates, because otherwise it doesn't know where on the world these nodes are supposed to be. And you also need to set up the layer, because in more advanced uses, GeoChart can have more than just points on it. You can also have shapes and such. And this specifies all the different layers of things you have. And in this case, if you just want items, you just specify items. And that's it. That's what we've covered in this video. That is the executive summary. And you should now be able to handle all that, at least in its most basic capacity. And that wraps it up for this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to wrap up our discussion of data, because now that we know the data format, we can now discuss the different ways you can get the data into the chart. It doesn't just have to be preloaded. You can also get it from URLs, from functions. There are also ways you can add and replace the data later on after the chart's created. So we're going to discuss the different ways of getting data into the chart and the basic data manipulations. And that will be the topic of the next lesson. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you there.